The Department of Housing and Urban Development is reporting a very concerning surge in the number of mortgage defaults and delinquencies for homeowners across America. In particular, they are showing a big spike in delinquencies among FHA loans for first-time homebuyers. With the most recent mortgage report showing that over 11% of FHA mortgage borrowers are now in default on their mortgage, with that default rate rising fast. And this is, of course, a concerning signal for the state of the U.S. housing market in 2024 and beyond, because if we continue to see these mortgage defaults, you know what that's going to turn into, everyone. That's going to turn into forced selling on the U.S. housing market at a time when home prices are just fundamentally overvalued. With the home value to income ratio in America now about 30% higher than its long-term norm, suggesting major home price downside if these mortgage defaults continue. And this is something we could already see happening right now, everyone, because the inventory of homes for sale on the US housing market, the number of listings, it's spiking, and it's spiking fast. Particularly in the states in dark red on this map, everyone. These are the ones with the biggest spike in inventory and the biggest spike in forced selling. And if you live in one of those states, or if you live in a city or a zip code where the inventory is spiking, you better watch out, because that's something that is a signal to you about a change going on in the market. With Bloomberg reporting that seriously underwater home mortgages just ticked up across the US, with southern states seeing the biggest jump in the share of very underwater homes. Now, before I get more into that article, I want to clearly define what an underwater mortgage is. That is a mortgage where the home value has now gone down below the mortgage amount. So say you bought a house for $400,000 a couple years ago with a $350,000 mortgage. Well, if that mortgage is underwater, it means the value is now maybe down to 340 or 330 or maybe even 300,000 in some cases. With roughly 1 in 37 homes across America now considered seriously underwater, and that share is much higher across a swath of southern states, according to data from Adam Data Solutions. With 2.7% of all homes nationally carrying balances at least 25% more than their market value in the first few months of the year. Now think about that, everyone. I mean, that seems like a lot, right? To have 3% of all mortgages be 25% underwater. I mean, to give you guys some perspective, there's around 50 to 60 million mortgages in America. So 3% being seriously underwater, that's 1.5 to 2 million mortgages where people are more than 25% below the property value. That's an indication that we're likely to see more forced selling into the future, particularly in some of the states here that Bloomberg lists as the ones with the biggest year-over-year increase in underwater mortgaged homes. They include Kentucky, Mississippi, Oklahoma, Florida, Louisiana, Wyoming, South Carolina, Arkansas, Colorado, Utah, Oregon, and Washington. If you're buying a home in some of those states, you might be seeing more of these seriously underwater mortgages popping up. For instance, a listing like this in Kentucky, you can see here it's a foreclosure on Zillow. It's a 4-bed, 3-bath, 2,200 square feet on a 1-acre lot. This house is, it's okay. It's got some nice hardwood floors. Could probably use some updating. Well, take a look at this, everyone. Zillow thought this house was worth up to $350,000 prior to the foreclosure, and then boom, the value estimate plummeted down to $220,000, which is less than what it sold for in 2016. Now, in some cases, those foreclosure list prices are actually starting bid prices when the property goes to auction, so we don't always know exactly what the property ended up selling for when we see it on Zillow. However, the point is very, very clear. When you look at that value history graph, is that when a property turns into a foreclosure or forced sale, the market value can plummet. And that's because the people trying to sell it, whether it's the existing owner or the bank, they just want to get it off their hands and convert it to cash as soon as possible, which is why an increase in mortgage defaults and foreclosures is concerning for the US housing market. However, according to data from Black Knight, you can see that the overall foreclosure inventory levels on the US housing market are actually still pretty low. Less than 1% of all the houses in America are foreclosure inventory, which is kind of similar to what it was in 06-07 at the peak of the last bubble, before we saw the big uptick in foreclosures where we got up to about a 4.5% foreclosure rate. That's what caused the last major crash, was a 4.5% foreclosure rate. And so we're still nowhere near the foreclosure rate levels of the last crash. And that's very important to understand. I'm not saying in this video that the mortgage defaults and foreclosures are at 2008 or 2009 levels right now. However, we could see that start to change based on the increase in mortgage defaults we're seeing, particularly on these FHA mortgages, everyone. And I want you to pay close attention to this data. It comes from HUD, the US government, and they're showing you here the 30-day and the 60-day delinquency rate on FHA mortgages. And you could see a year ago, it was a 5.3% 30-day delinquency rate, 1.7% 60-day delinquency rate. Fast forward this year, it's a 6.6% 30-day delinquency and a 2% 60-day delinquency. So pretty sizable uptick in the 30-day delinquency, and we're starting to see that go into the 60-day. And of particular concern is that the number of new 90-day delinquencies in the second quarter of 2024 was 152,000 new 90-day delinquencies. Whereas prior to the pandemic, like in second quarter of 2019, there was only 85,000 new 90-day delinquencies. So almost 2 times more new 90-day delinquencies on these FHA mortgages. And these are the type of mortgages that are very risky, right? Like these are the first-time home buyer loans backed by the US government where people can buy a house and put like 2 or 3% down. These are the mortgages where we're seeing the most stress. And these are, the areas of America where we're seeing the inventory go up the most. Because in particular, everyone, it's in this pocket here in the Southeast, in Texas and Arizona, where the inventory levels are skyrocketing. And there just so happen to be quite a few FHA mortgages that are originated in these states. These states are very prominent for FHA mortgages. And we can see in particular, everyone, Florida is number 1 in terms of inventory growth. Arizona is number 2. We got Georgia at number 4, South Carolina at number 5. All at 40% or higher inventory growth year over year. And this is concerning to me because when I look at how overvalued some of these housing markets are, they are very overvalued. Like in Georgia, home prices are 30% overvalued right now. We have an overvaluation rate of 30%. We've never seen anything like this in Georgia's housing market before in terms of overvaluation here. You can see that we have a lot of downside risk in Georgia, particularly if these mortgage defaults and inventory levels keep going up. Same thing in Florida, everyone. I've covered Florida a lot in the last couple weeks, but as you can see, the overvaluation rate, 30%. When's the last time we saw that? 2006, 2007, before the big crash in Florida. We have lots of downside in Florida. We have lots of downside in Tennessee, everyone. Home prices in Tennessee are 29% overvalued. And in a market like Arizona, they're 24% overvalued. And so what you guys need to watch out for if you're a home buyer and investor is if home prices in your area are very overvalued while inventory is skyrocketing. Because if you're in that combination, well, that suggests there's a much greater risk of big home price declines. You could see a big wipeout in terms of equity, in terms of value drops in areas that are heavily overvalued and where inventory is spiking. And luckily for you guys on Reventure app, I added a filters tool where we can actually filter the metros that meet that criteria of being the most overvalued. Let's say at least 20% overvalued, and let's say inventory is up at least 20% year over year. These would be the metros that fit that criteria of skyrocketing inventory, very overvalued, where I think prices have a higher likelihood of dropping. Maybe if we want to extend it a bit more, we could say 30% inventory growth and 30% overvalued. Then we get a much more narrow list of, okay, like these are the areas that we really got to watch out for this year. You can see some of them here on this list. If I'm a home buyer in any of these metros, I'm being very, very careful right now. Now, of course, everyone, I've been warning of a housing downturn for the last 3 years, and it's something that hasn't happened yet on a national basis, but has happened in a lot of different markets. And so I think some of you out there, you might be saying to yourselves like, okay, Nick, I see the data, but I'm frustrated that home prices in my city and state are still really, really high, and I'm not seeing the relief that I would expect to see just yet. And I want to tell you guys that that's normal in this stage of the housing cycle. That's normal in this stage of the housing cycle. We're still only about 1.5 to 2 years in to the slowdown and downturn in the housing market, one that's corresponded with all types of government intervention in the housing market that occurred over the last several years that were used to kind of prop up the market. In fact, the US government still has restrictions on foreclosures for FHA mortgages, with Black Knight reporting that 70% of serious delinquencies remain protected by either active forbearance, bankruptcy, or loss mitigation. Now, more and more of those foreclosure protections are going to burn off as 2024 progresses, so watch out for more forced selling on the US housing market throughout the year and bigger spikes in inventory in a lot of different cities and counties. And what you're going to want to do to understand the areas that have the biggest risk of major price declines this year, you're going to want to go to www.reventure.app and use the filters tool to isolate the areas that are most overvalued and where inventory is surging. In this case, I just created a short list of all the counties in America that best meet this criteria. And you can see here, I just sorted them by population. So these would be some of the highest population counties that I think are big in the crosshairs this year of price declines, particularly if these mortgage defaults continue. So head to www.reventure.app and sign up for a premium plan to access that overvaluation and inventory growth data. Make sure to use that filters tool. You can access all of that information for only $39 a month under the premium plan. I would also encourage some of you to do the annual pass where you can save 15% a year on the monthly cost. Head to www.reventure.app right now to understand the risk of home price declines in your area.